What if I told you your deepest strength is the very thing that makes weak men run? It's not because you're too much. It's because they haven't grown enough to meet you where you are. Your emotional depth, the way you feel fully, love deeply, and speak truth even when your voice shakes doesn't make you difficult. It makes you dangerous to the ones who've spent their lives avoiding their own reflection. This isn't just sensitivity. This is power. A kind of inner fire that calls out everything hidden, everything fragile in those who haven't done the work to face their shadow. Today, we're peeling back the curtain on something rarely said out loud. Why your presence threatens those who haven't yet learned to hold themselves accountable. If you've ever asked, "What's wrong with me?" for simply being real, stay right here. What you're about to hear might just wake you up to who you truly are. Imagine a dark room. You walk in, and without hesitation you flip on the light. Not to expose anyone, not to make a scene. You just want to see clearly because that's how you live. In truth, in clarity. But suddenly, people around you wince. Some cover their eyes, others turn away like you've done something wrong. You didn't scream, you didn't attack. All you did was show up fully lit. That's what it feels like when you bring emotional depth into a world addicted to surface-level comfort. You're not trying to make anyone uncomfortable. But for someone who spent their life hiding from their own wounds, your presence is a confrontation. Your honesty becomes a mirror they never asked for, and the image staring back is something they are not ready to see. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the part of ourselves we bury, repress, and pretend doesn't exist. It holds every fear we refuse to name, every pain we never healed, every part of us we think would make us unlovable. The moment someone like you walks into their life, someone who is not afraid of their own shadow, they panic. Because you don't just see them, you feel them. And that, to the unprepared, feels like exposure. You show empathy without needing a reason. You tell the truth even when silence would be easier. You sit in hard emotions. Not to be dramatic, but because you've learned that healing doesn't happen in the shallow end. And those traits? They make you rare. But they also make you threatening to anyone who is still pretending. This is the fear you never meant to trigger. The fear of being seen too clearly, of being known too deeply, of being challenged by someone who refuses to play small. Have you ever watched someone pull away just because you were honest? Maybe you shared something real painful, personal, and they shut down. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you said something they've never said out loud. Maybe you cried in front of them, and instead of leaning in, they grew quiet, stiff, uncomfortable. You weren't too intense. You were too real. And that's something many people have no idea how to handle. They weren't rejecting you. They were rejecting their own discomfort. Here's the truth. Your depth is not the problem. Their unexamined wounds are. And yet, when this happens often enough, it's easy to internalize the message that you need to be quieter, softer, easier to digest. That maybe if you just watered yourself down a little more, someone would finally stay. But every time you shrink, you lose a piece of yourself. And what you're really doing is making space for people who are still hiding, instead of holding space for the ones who are ready to grow. It's a lonely place to be misunderstood, mislabeled, made to feel like your heart is some kind of burden. But that loneliness, it's not a punishment. It's a clearing, a necessary space for something better. Because the ones who will love you fully won't flinch when the light comes on. They'll be the ones reaching for their own switch too. So, I'll ask you this. Have you ever watched someone pull away just because you showed up as your whole self? You're not alone, and you're not too much. You're simply ahead of those still learning how to be honest with themselves. From the time you were little, the world started whispering rules into your ear. Be easier. Be quieter. Don't cry so loud. Don't ask so many questions. Don't feel so deeply. Maybe you heard it in school, when someone said you were too sensitive, or at home, when your silence was rewarded more than your truth. You learned, early and often, that there was something inconvenient about your emotional depth, that your light needed a dimmer switch. And somewhere along the way, society wrapped all those messages into something more seductive. They called it being low maintenance. They praised the girl who didn't need much, who didn't ask for clarity, who laughed things off, stayed chill, stayed small. She became the cool girl, and millions of women were taught to shape themselves in her image. But here's the catch. The cool girl is a mask. She doesn't cry in front of others, even when it hurts. She doesn't speak up when something feels wrong, because she's afraid of being called dramatic. She doesn't need anything, because needing something, love, attention, depth, has been framed as weakness. In this culture, complexity is treated like chaos, and simplicity, like submission, is mistaken for strength. But what happens when you don't fit into that mold? When you do feel deeply? When silence tastes like betrayal? When your emotions are not a problem, but a compass? You begin to carry the weight of being too much, in a world that glorifies being just enough. It's not your fault. The world wasn't designed for women like you to take up space. It was designed to reward predictability. And your inner world, your vast, brilliant, often misunderstood inner world, does not follow a script. You've probably been told to toughen up, not because you were weak, but because you made others uncomfortable with how clearly you could name what they were afraid to feel. That's the quiet punishment women like you face. Not being loud, but being honest. Let me ask you something. Do you remember the last time you swallowed your tears just to keep someone else comfortable? When you smiled through something that broke your heart because you were afraid they'd say you were too emotional? That moment wasn't your weakness. That was your survival instinct kicking in, because you've been taught that emotion is dangerous. But let's be clear. The rules you've been given were never about truth. They were about control. They were about shrinking you to fit someone else's comfort zone. And here's the shift, the part no one tells you. You were never meant to fit into that box. You were meant to break it. Because those cultural scripts, they're not law. They're a test. A test of how long you'll betray your own soul for the illusion of acceptance. A test of how much you'll hide just to be loved in a way that doesn't even see the real you. Your emotional depth is not a flaw. It's evidence that you're alive, fully, painfully, powerfully, and the world might try to quiet that, but you don't have to listen anymore. You don't have to dim your light for people who never learned how to handle brightness. You don't have to trade honesty for approval. You get to take up space, with your voice, with your story, with your whole self. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And that's exactly what most people do. They live their lives being pulled by invisible strings, patterns they don't recognize, fears they never name, wounds they've buried so deep, they forget they were ever cut. That's what Jung meant by the shadow. Not evil, not darkness for the sake of it, but the hidden, the denied, the parts of you that got shut down before they ever had a chance to breathe. The anger you weren't allowed to express. The sadness you were told was weakness. The desire that made others uncomfortable. These parts didn't vanish. They just went underground. And here's the hard truth. What gets buried doesn't die. It controls you from the dark. The shadow is like the rest of the iceberg beneath the surface. You might only see what floats above the polished, presentable version of yourself, but the vast, unmapped territory beneath is where the real work lives. The pain, the depth, the raw truth that never got spoken. The more you suppress it, the more it starts to sabotage your life in subtle ways. You might call it bad luck. You might say, "I keep attracting the same kind of people," or "I don't know why I feel this way." But what's really happening is that your shadow is choosing for you until you finally turn and face it. That's where shadow work comes in. It's not about fixing yourself. It's about finally seeing yourself, fully, without shame. Growth doesn't happen through perfection. It happens when you stop running. When you sit with the part of you that's been crying in the corner for years. When you ask it, "What do you need from me now?" That's not weakness. That's maturity. Real, soul-level maturity. And if you're someone who feels deeply, someone who's not afraid to cry, to speak the truth that others avoid, to hold space for pain without immediately trying to fix it, that's not random. That's evidence that you've already done some of this work. Whether you knew the term or not, you've been face to face with your shadow. And that's why your emotional depth makes people uncomfortable. Not because you're broken, but because you're further along. Think of it like this. Most people are still walking around with masks on, afraid to take them off. And there you are, barefaced, honest, present. They don't know what to do with that. Because when you've built your identity on avoiding your own pain, someone who's at peace with theirs feels like a threat. So ask yourself this. If you started looking at the parts of you you've tried to hide, what would shift? Because those pieces you've buried, they aren't your enemy. They're your compass. And the more you integrate them, the more whole you become. Jung also spoke about archetypes, especially the feminine. Not in a gendered way, but as a powerful symbolic force that lives in all of us. The feminine archetype is intuitive, inward, nurturing, and radically honest. It's the part of you that doesn't need to be explained to be understood. The part that knows things without needing to prove them. That energy is ancient. It's been dismissed in modern culture as irrational or dramatic, but it holds a wisdom older than logic. And for many women, reclaiming their emotional depth is the first step to reconnecting with this inner feminine power. It's not about being softer, it's about being more you, whole, unapologetic, awake. Because the truth is, emotional depth isn't just a personality trait. It's a sign that you've begun the journey inward, the kind of journey most people never take. And when you start walking that path, you don't just change your own life, you shift the energy in every room you enter. You stop being controlled by fate, and you start creating your future. Not every man is afraid of emotional depth, but the ones who haven't faced their own demons, the ones still hiding from themselves, they are. They wear masks to survive. Masks that look like confidence, success, dominance. But look closer, and you'll see the fear stitched underneath. Fear of being vulnerable, fear of not measuring up, fear of being seen in their raw, unfiltered state. Because when you come along grounded, real, emotionally present, they don't see your beauty. They see everything in themselves they've refused to confront. This isn't about shaming men. This is about understanding the walls they build. The world taught them that feeling is weakness. That emotion is something to conquer, not understand. So, they armor up. They mock vulnerability, ghost when things get real. Stay in shallow waters because diving deeper means touching things they've buried for years. One of the most common masks? False confidence. The loud, overcompensating kind that demands attention but crumbles under intimacy. Another? Emotional detachment disguised as strength. They say they don't do drama or keep things chill. But what they really mean is they don't want to feel anything they can't control. And of course, the fear of commitment. Not because they don't want love, but because real love demands exposure, and that scares them more than being alone. You might have seen it play out. You share something meaningful, something real, and suddenly they go silent. They pull back. Not because you did anything wrong, but because your honesty lit up a part of them they've kept in the dark. That's not your fault. It's not even really about you. It's about the version of themselves they're not ready to meet. They build walls not because you're dangerous, but because your light reveals their cracks. Think about it. How many times have you toned yourself down, held your truth back, just so someone else wouldn't feel insecure around you? How often have you questioned your worth because someone else couldn't hold space for it? You were never too much. They were simply not prepared. Psychology calls this a developmental gap. Some people are still emotionally in the early chapters of their story where feeling is still threatening, and honesty feels like an attack. When you've done the work, and they haven't, you're not just speaking a different language, you're operating in a different emotional dimension. It's not your job to drag them up to meet you. It's your job to stay rooted in who you are. And here's what no one tells you. Trying to be less of yourself for someone else never makes them feel more secure. It just makes you feel invisible. You start censoring your joy, your intuition, your sadness, your fire just to keep someone from flinching. And in doing that, you abandon yourself. So let's say this out loud. You don't have to shrink for anyone. If your honesty makes someone uncomfortable, that's a mirror for them, not a flaw in you. If your vulnerability feels too intense, maybe they've just never been invited that far into their own soul. And if your emotional intelligence threatens their sense of control, maybe it's time they started asking why. The truth is, your depth demands presence. And not everyone is ready to give that. Some are still hiding, still armoring up, still performing. But that doesn't mean you need to dim yourself down to meet them where they are. Because here's the freedom: you don't have to make yourself smaller so someone else can feel bigger. You were not built to be less. You were built to be whole. Not all pain is meant to break you. Some pain exists to wake you up. There's a kind of ache that doesn't come to destroy, but to clear space. The kind that forces you to stop pretending, to drop the performance, and finally ask, who am I really? And sometimes that awakening begins the moment someone calls you too much. Think of your emotional depth like fire. In the wrong hands, fire can burn. It can terrify. People try to control it, snuff it out, or keep it locked away. But in the right hands with someone who understands its value, fire becomes warmth, clarity, life. It's not the fire that's the problem. It's whether the person standing near it knows how to hold it without fear. And you are that flame. Your intensity, your insight, your ability to feel deeply and speak truthfully, it's never been the issue. The issue is that some people are emotionally hollow. They live in a kind of emptiness they don't yet know how to fill. And when they meet someone full, someone like you, they can't understand it. So, they label it. They call it overwhelming, dramatic, too much. But let's get something clear. Their emptiness is not your responsibility to manage. There are millions of people like you, people who've been told to shrink, soften, quiet down. People who felt isolated because they process life on a deeper frequency. And here's the beautiful part: they're waking up. They're remembering. They're unlearning every message that told them to tone it down just to be loved. You're not alone. And you never were. There's a quiet revolution happening. People reclaiming their voice, their emotions, their presence, and you are part of it. The moment you stop apologizing for your sensitivity, you start becoming powerful. Not loud, not aggressive, powerful. Because real power comes from owning yourself, all the way. You don't have to earn the right to be real. You already have it. Being authentic is not something you need permission for. It's your natural state before the world taught you how to hide. So let me ask you, if today, right now, you gave yourself full permission to be exactly who you are, deep, honest, fiery, and whole, what would shift? What relationships would change? What conversations would you finally have? What boundaries would you stop bending? The truth is, when you stop cutting parts of yourself off to make others comfortable, you start attracting people who don't need you to shrink. People who meet you with presence, not performance. Who see your emotional range, not as a threat, but as an invitation. Because here's something nobody tells you when you're growing up in a world that fears feeling. Your depth is not a liability. It's leadership. It's insight. It's emotional intelligence disguised as intuition. And the world is starving for more of it, not less. You were never too much. They were just not ready to meet someone so full of life. So stop asking who you need to become to be enough for them. Start asking who they need to become to hold space for you. This is not about proving your worth. You've already done that by surviving everything that tried to make you forget it. This is about remembering, really remembering that your presence, your light, your truth is not a burden. It's a gift. So now, you get to decide. Do you keep bending yourself into pieces, or do you rise? Do you keep dimming the light, or do you finally let it blaze? The world has had enough half versions of you. It's time to choose wholeness, to choose presence, to choose you, not the fear, not the silence, not the approval. You. This is your time, not to shrink, not to simplify, not to become easier to swallow. This is your time to stand in your fullness, your complexity, your power. You don't need to be smaller to be lovable. You don't need to make your emotions easier for others to digest. You were never meant to be one-dimensional. You were meant to shine in every shade of who you are, bold, raw, honest, and unfiltered. Your emotional depth is not a flaw. It is not a mistake, a burden, or something that needs to be fixed. It is a rare strength, a compass, a form of wisdom that too many people are afraid to access. But not you. You're already reaching for it. You're already learning how to carry it without apology. So if you've ever been told you're too much, too intense, too emotional, share this. Not just for yourself, but for the next person who needs to hear that they're not broken for feeling deeply. They're just brave enough to feel fully. And if you're ready, leave a comment. Say it out loud. Have you ever been called too much? And how did you rise from it? Let this be your space. Your story matters more than you think. Because here's what's real. The world is not better off when you hide your fire. It becomes brighter, warmer, more alive when you let it burn. This world needs more of your fire, not less.